Okay, and we're back to talk about BF cache reporting. Let me share my tab and okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Awesome. So we're a bit past time. I'll try to make it brief. Basically, in the past, we talked about BF cache reporting already. We decided that so the motivation here is to align metrics with user experience, and BF cache is part of user experience, as Michael pointed out. When Chrome implemented implemented BF cache, some navigations that were previously cache navigations disappeared, and that goes against the notion of the best and fastest navigations are the ones that never really happen. So we want to align metrics with user experience, and therefore we want to include BF cache navigations as part of the entries that we report. We also decided in the past to avoid from overriding metrics for the BF cache navigated page, which also includes all the previous metrics. So we decided to avoid overriding them and then fire new entries of some sort. And similarly, we decided not to mess around with having multiple time origins for these multiple navigations on a single document, and just have a single time origin that correlates to the very first navigation that happened on that page. And so we want to fire new entries, and I played around with a few ideas related to what that may look like. I have a few options here, but in the process of writing down those options, I ended up with a favorite, and I hope you all will agree. So the first option, which seemed like the most obvious one, is to just fire another navigation entry. So navigation entries live in an array that up until now only had a single item in it. And it seemed nice to reuse that array and to add more navigation entries to that array, with the bonus of not adding yet another performance entry type, which we already have a bunch of. The part that I was slightly worried about, and I think we discussed last time, was around compatibility and whether this is something that we can actually do. Because we've been shipping navigation timing entries as a single item in that array for a long while, there is some concern that websites have come to rely on the fact that there's only one item in that array, and will break in new and exciting ways as a result of us adding more entries to it. To answer that question, I played around with a Chromium prototype, run it over a benchmark of 100,000 top Alexa sites. And it turns out that 0.125% of those actually touch that second entry in that array when it's there. And that is 2.3% of overall navigation timing users. Then I dove into a bunch of examples. And so the initial numbers were somewhat discouraging. Also, a lot of those websites are fairly known websites that I suspected would have a lot of usage beyond just the number of websites. But looking at the examples, none of them relied on there being exactly one item, at least none of the examples that I actually found. And the example seemed to just loop over all the entries in the array. And therefore, when it has only a single entry, they loop over one entry. When it has more, they loop over those as well, either as a filter or as a for loop. But generally, they seem to be just collecting metrics from all those entries, which means that if we were to add a navigation entry to that array, that will impact the metrics by including those BF cache navigations in the statistics that those websites collect, which on the one hand, it will result in a metrics change, but at the same time, I think this is the exact metrics change that we want those extra navigations to affect. So from a compatibility question, I started out pessimistic, but ended up optimistic, and I think this can fly and this can be something that browsers can actually ship. The downside of this approach is that we'll have a navigation timing entry that will basically only have a lot of zero valued properties inside those entries. So for all the metrics related to the load time of the resource and all those other things that are relevant for an actual navigation will just be zero or very close to zero, or in a BF cache navigation timing entry. So not even very close to zero, because we don't really have load time because load is not retriggered. We don't have DOM content loaded time. So a lot of those entries will just be zero value. So that seems a bit wasteful and potentially not great. So I took the liberty of trying to see how someone would filter paints, for example, per navigation based on that kind of like that sort of API shape. And from the code's perspective, it seems fairly reasonable, and we can use just the filter methods on arrays to perform any kind of filtering on existing entries, and in this case, based on the navigation start and end time for the various BF cache entries or non-BF cache entries. So it seems fairly straightforward and fairly ergonomic to do that. The second option that I considered is to introduce a new type of navigation entry that doesn't include all those zero values, but otherwise includes all the same information that is included in the first one, which is mostly the start time and the timestamp that we need from that navigation. And that, like a code example that would use that kind of an entry would look very much similar to this one, only that we won't be looking at the navigation array, and we'll have to somehow special case the first load case from the BF cache navigation cases. A third option that I thought would be neat, but then somewhat reconsidered, is to have pointers to all the relevant entries just hanging off of this new entry. So we'll have an array with all the paints, all the LCP candidates, everything else just hanging off of that entry. And that seemed ergonomic enough until I realized that at the time that the navigation entry is created, we don't have all those times necessarily. So that will either will have to result to polling similar to the navigation timing entry of the page, but that's not great, or we'll have to do something different. And Yeah. And the fourth option is to have some sort of a performance observer entry list hanging off of the new navigation entry, where we basically the caller can set performance observers individually on each one of those navigation instances and get entry, like use get entries by type or by name on those individually on top of performance observers registered on the main page. And I guess for me, it has a bunch. It's weird and it's unclear how that fits with other observers on the page, and I'm not sure what the benefits are. So essentially, after thinking about all those different options, I somewhat landed with a favorite as option one that basically, because it is compatible and because it seems to fit nicely with the current API shape, we just add a new navigation timing entry for each one of the BF cache navigations. And then the question arises, if that works for BF timing navigations, should we also use that for other types of navigations? So assuming this works, maybe we can also extend it to the SPA nav case or other types of soft navigations that we'll want to tackle in the future. For example, I thought about, one thing is backgrounded tabs are also that backgrounded tabs that get foregrounded can also, to some extent, maybe something we'll want to report on in the future, and that can also fit into that model. But I don't think we need to dive into that now, because that part may be more controversial than what we need to discuss here. So I'm interested in your thoughts about adding that kind of a like extra navigation entries to the array. Any concerns? What do you all think?
To me, it seems pretty ergonomic to reuse the existing navigation timing entry array.
Thanks.
Yav, in your testing, when did folks actually read the list of navigation timings?
When in the page lifecycle?
Yeah, because I think you would only get like a subsequent entry in the array after a BF cache. And so you'd have to read it. So if you're using a performance observer with like buffering and etc., and you all of a sudden generated a second entry, it would fire a second time. And so even if you just wrote a loop over, or even if you just assumed only the first entry, that same observer, like that second entry would be the 0th, you know what I mean? So is it on page unload that you would actually get an array of multiple entry sizes?
So I haven't done that kind of an analysis. I looked at the code rather than debugged those sites. That could indeed be interesting. To me, the point that you're making is a good one, and is one that those existing sites are even less likely to see those BF cache navigations than I thought they would, because those BF cache navigations are likely to happen after the point in time right now that they are collecting those metrics. So they're likely iterating that array before.
I naturally would want to read this on load, perhaps, and even if I iterate the array, you'd never have a second entry.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
Yov, as part of this discussion, is there anything else that we would track as part of a BF cache navigation, like a duration of it in any way, or work that it kicked off? Or I mean, I'm assuming there's non-zero work to swap it back in.
Yeah.
Is that trackable? Is that something that browsers have insight into how long it takes?
So I think that we will need to kick off one thing that I didn't cover and I potentially should have is that, yeah, for example, we would want to re-kick off, similar to the SPA discussion, we will want to kick off the first paint, first contentful paint, LCP, FID, as extra entries as well in that scenario, and then we would filter those extra entries based on the start times of the navigation timing. So I don't think we can have a duration for the navigation, because basically we want to keep track of all the things that particular BF cache navigation did up until a point in time that it got either unloaded or brought back to the BF cache. So we would want to essentially look at all the different, like the other metrics, in which we will need to refire and collect them for those navigations. We will, but there's no way for us to have a end time as part of the entry. We'll have to look at either the end time of the next entry, or, if there is none, then everything beyond a single point in time.
Hey, Yoav, I just want to throw in here that what Firefox does is we note when BF cache is used to restore, but we don't note a duration.
Yeah, but would it be feasible from your perspective to refire various paint entries and FID, for example, if that were implemented in the case of a BF cache restore?
That is possible.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
But the thing that we're mostly interested right now is just counting when the cache is used. So.
Yeah.
Hey, Yoav. So one thing I noticed is that all the proposed options looks very different in terms of things they are reporting. So I wonder, like, what is the actual problem we're trying to solve here, or like what are the things that we really want to report? Because yeah, that's the question.
So I don't think that they are different in terms of what they're reporting. I think that the main bit that we want to report is just the A, that a navigation happened, and B, that it happened at a certain point in time. And then we want to refire entries, and I should have included that explicitly in the slides, and I didn't. But we want to refire entries and then filter them based on those start times. So the reported bits are not huge. It's just that we're looking for a way to report them in a way that will fit the rest of the performance APIs.
Okay, thanks.
Even if those values are sometimes 0, or a lot of them are 0.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Any other questions? if there are no major objections, I think I can write up something more concrete and yes, send it for the group for review. Cool. Thank you. And I think we can now move on to Andrew. And is input pending? Yeah.
Yep. All right. Let me just get presenting here. Okay, is that working for everyone?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, cool. All right. Well, hello, everyone. I'm going to be talking today about everyone's favorite Boolean, is input pending, TPAC 2020 edition. So for a brief overview of kind of topics I wanted to cover today was, first of all, like a brief recap, what the API is, what use cases it seeks to accomplish, some of the history. And then moving on to some of the issues that have sort of been chatted about recently on the GitHub, some interactions with long tasks, some guarantees regarding yielding to input, and maybe if we have time at the end, we could talk about the incubation status. Yoav, do you think that would be more suited for tomorrow's rechartering discussion, or is it worth covering here?
I wasn't thinking of reintroducing new incubations as part of the new charter, but we can discuss it here.
Sure, sounds good. Cool. Without further ado, so for those who aren't really familiar, is input pending has had a long and storied history. First arising as like should yield, which was like a more general, like I would like to yield to input and other high priority tasks. And over time, we sort of refined it down to just input, since that accomplished the large majority of the use cases that we cared about. We talked about it at TPAC 2018, 2019, and worked out some stuff like security issues and calls since then, as well as did a Chrome origin trial in 2019, where we got some cool and fun results. So yeah, thanks to everyone for all the feedback over the years or the input. Okay. So what is the API? So in essence, it is a way to remain responsive for work that doesn't want to yield. And you might ask, like, why would work not want to yield as frequently as, say, like every frame? And a lot of work that's done on the web, especially with modern frameworks today, is we have work queues and scheduling done. So we break our work into tiny bits, and we know which of that is display blocking and which parts that we would know that would change in response to certain types of inputs. You can imagine, say, if you're doing like a big component render, and then you get like a user input press in, say, like, for example, on Facebook, like the notification jewel, you're going to want to stop what you're doing right there and pivot towards like rendering what the user wanted. And in order to do that, we need this sort of input, or we need the sort of insight provided by the user agent to respond to user input directly. So yeah, basically it's a tool to make smarter, longer tasks. So there's a code example on the right side. I'm sure everyone has seen it like a million times before. Cool. So yeah, some questions that have risen up, like, for example, like why input only? And the primary reason is just because like the large majority of the use cases that we've aggregated from people who are interested in APIs like this are primarily for display blocking work that changes in response to input. And in those cases, is input pending does as advertised. And you might be wondering, it's like, yeah, this also blocks painting and network, and that's okay. The user agent is entrusted, if they're going to leverage this API, with the knowledge that, yes, their work is highest in display blocking priority. And most importantly, is this actually worthwhile? Is this a trade-off worth making versus just like slicing our tasks into smaller bits? And from our measurements and from our work with partners, we've determined that you can actually save a significant amount of time and increase your scheduler's throughput by simply just yielding less frequently when you're performing the same user blocking degree of work. So like one of our partners obtained a throughput improvement of 25% by yielding less often in general. And that's a not great experience without is-input pending, since it'll just be frozen for the user. Sorry. Cool. So one of the first topics I want to talk about is integrations with the long tasks API. So as everyone knows and loves, long tasks API reports like tasks that take over, I think it's like 50 milliseconds. And there are cases where you might want to make your scheduler quantum for your is-input pending, like long-ish tasks, past that duration. And in which case, it's sort of an open question as to how we should expose this in aggregate metrics. So it's not quite a like long task, so to speak, in that like it remains unresponsive, because like like sites that leverage is-input pending will still become responsive. So some of the ideas that have been tossed around were like adding extra annotations to the long task performance timeline entries, or maybe just doing nothing at all. Maybe it makes sense to just still report these as long tasks and let the developer reason about that independently. So I was kind of curious folks' thoughts on this issue and how potential integration would work. Particularly from RUM vendors, if you think that like an extra bit of signal here would be valuable.
Well, I'm not a RUM vendor, but I would think adding it to an extra annotation would be very beneficial, especially for our internal reporting.
So the idea would be there would be some sort of like Boolean or something on the long task entry itself saying that there had been user input during that long task?
Mostly that we like invoked is-input pending and remained like accountable to user input, so to speak.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So there was a long task, but the app tried to reason with the user input and probably or maybe ended its work earlier as a result of detecting that?
Exactly, yeah. So it's very easily polyfillable, of course. But for like more aggregate metrics where you might just drop this in on a page, you might want an additional view into it.
Yeah, I think it's important because for us, the way we use long task is to determine bad sessions, but you cannot say a session is bad just because it had long task, right?
Right.
What you really care is that the long task actually blocked some user input, and adding this annotation seems like I don't know if solved that, but addressed most of the cases.
The really tricky case, I think, is when people are also using is-input pending for other use cases, or at least aren't yielding immediately after calling is-input pending. If we were guaranteed that people would yield immediately after calling is-input pending, I would say we would just consider that to be a break in the task and only fire a long task if you had a contiguous block without a call to is-input pending. Because there's no guarantee there, it's a little bit hairy. I wonder, one other option would be to let people register for sort of a different task entry, that like we have regular long tasks and then we have long tasks including no is-input pending calls. I don't love that, but it gives you, I think, a little bit more flexibility than extra annotations, because it actually lets you know how long those blocks are. Whereas if you just have a 2-second block that says there were some calls to is-input pending, that isn't necessarily enough information for you to know whether or not you were well behaved.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because it sort of extends beyond is-input pending in particular and sort of introduces the notion of like a sanctioned long task, so to speak, where it's like you know what you're doing, you're playing with fire, and you think it's justified.
And I think that's a decision that we can't know what the web developer is doing. I think we kind of need to rely on the web developer to select the thing that makes sense for their particular use case.
Cool.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
This actually sounds really similar to a problem that has come up in Lighthouse before around using the deadline of request title callback. And one problem we see there is that developers might be checking the deadline, but they're checking the deadline way too infrequently. And so they still end up with a lot of scheduled work. I wonder if would we need to like include a rate at how frequently they're checking is input pending, or maybe that's not a concern. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I would also share the same skepticism with Tim's point that it's like you can be calling it as frequently as you want, but if you're not making like active yielding decisions based on it, then maybe it's not as valuable as a signal.
So what about just including in the long task an array of timestamps of when the callback was invoked?
Which callback would that be?
Oh, sorry, the is input pending function.
I see. I guess that is kind of problematic since you can imagine like we could have a lot of work items. I don't think that would scale too well.
Yeah, I think you'd need to somehow only surface the cases where the timestamp delta between consecutive calls was sufficiently large, and then it sounds a little bit like you're reinventing long tasks. You can imagine something similar, though, where you have an array of long blocks of time during which there was no is input pending call. With
Also worth abstracting out a little bit and just noting long tasks that blocked input with their own designation, irrespective of whether is input pending was called.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. It was like if there was also a was input pending part of it, and there were is input pending calls, and whether after there was input pending, there was an is input pending call and it ended frequent, like that would kind of give an indicator that the app was responsive to the user input rather than just checking it on a loop and not doing anything.
Do we get that just via input delay?
If it's over the threshold?
Yeah, the threshold right now, I think the default is 100. You can make it as low as 16, which is lower than the long task threshold. So there's overlap there. Yeah, like I know there are folks who measure long tasks in RUM and still report total blocking time and still use that as a useful signal, but like we see it as a useful synthetic metric where you don't actually have real interactions, and you don't, when you can actually measure interactions, that's the source of truth.
Cool.
And
that's good to know, yeah.
It does get a little bit tricky once you start talking about sites with moderate data volume. If you have infinite data, all you look at is input response times. But when you have limited data, there are cases where I think long tasks does give you the will let you identify regressions you would not be able to identify otherwise.
yeah, I mean, it's a leading indicator of what you can predict will happen, and similarly why it's used in synthetic, which is why I think just knowing that is input pending was called, from my perspective, doesn't matter how frequently, doesn't matter if they actually yielded, like the fact that it attempted to is enough to give confidence, perhaps, that like.
I mean, if it's a 2-second long task and they yielded during that first and last is input pending, I don't think that's should be considered a good user experience. So I think that's the kind of cases we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, we're definitely going to end up with a heuristic solution no matter what, because it's like the long task metric itself is inherently quite heuristic. It's just a matter of like, is any annotation helpful in the first place, I think. Which it sounds like it probably is. So that's good signal. I think that it's probably fine intuitively to err on the side of like over reporting information about the long task execution, especially since long task actionability is something that's like very important to people?
So I'm not sure if this suggestion, if I missed it or not, but what Nicholas, what you said about like long duration is, long tasks right now are over 50 milliseconds, but what if it was over 50 milliseconds between calls to is input pending, rather than giving an array of all the timestamps and stuff like that, like just saying what was the longest duration of time.
So like a sort of an input starved metric where it's like you checked is input pending, but you didn't yield for n milliseconds. Or you didn't check is input pending at all. That seems like a pretty decent signal.
Yeah, this wouldn't tell you if they would have yielded, but it at least tells you that they checked often enough to, if they were well behaved and would have yielded, that it wouldn't. You know what I mean? Because I think the case that Nicholas is pointing out is if you're not using a framework that uses a user scheduler that calls this often enough, you could still lose that opportunity. You could still have essentially a long task.
Right. Cool. Yeah, that sounds good. I will head back to the GitHub issue with some of these great suggestions. All right. So I think we're running a little bit short on time, so I'll just jump towards one of the other topics that we've discussed, which is the actual mechanism of yielding itself. You saw in my cutesy code example earlier, we just called an imaginary yield method, but that doesn't exist. And the big question is should it? So what users of input pending right now are doing is leveraging something like set timeout or post message in order to schedule a new macro task, with the assumption that like, okay, maybe if we enqueue a new macro task and yield to the browser will probably end up handling the input for us. And this works well in practice since most UAs prioritize input very highly. And so this is like a fairly reasonable guarantee. In the worst case, you'll just check is input pending again. It might return true, in which you yield again. So like there is a possibility of a very pathological case that the spec permits, where it's like you can yield as much as you want, and is input pending could still return true by the spec. But again, unlikely because UAs prioritize input. So I guess my question to the group would be, is this something that we should address at a spec level? Is it worth introducing this kind of normative guarantee? Or does it suffice to say, just let the user maybe detect this case if it actually notices this being an issue, which again, like they probably wouldn't run into it in the field anyway. That was a mouthful. But one other thing that has come up was leveraging scheduler.yield. Which Scott talked a little bit about yesterday, how it has the ability to yield for input level priority, in which case that would provide the sort of normative guarantees that we'd seek out here.
Just one note on that, it could. It's not necessarily in any kind of proposal yet.
Right. It's in our dreams, maybe.
Yeah, and we aren't experimenting with an input level guarantee. Like there is no input priority at this point, right?
There's
so like,
user blocking, right? I think
user blocking, right? But like the proposed spec right now isn't to map any other task queues onto these priorities. Like it's fairly well isolated, and the browser has freedom. So this problem wouldn't go away even if we had a user blocking. Even if you could yield to user blocking, that this problem would still exist. We'd have to map input to one of these priorities, which
right. It would still be contingent on the UA under the hood thinking that input is user blocking.
Right. So we'd want to do something with the yield proposal. We'd have to augment the yield proposal as it currently is in some way to handle this situation. And I was kind of expressing yesterday, like I don't think that's our primary goal right now, but it'd be great to get a signal of should it be part of our goal.
My intuition. Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
I just wanted to ask, taken to that logical extreme, if the scheduling.yield proposal is extended to handle this, and you already talked about the ability to yield and then return back to me with high priority afterwards because I was the one nice enough to yield, does it eventually just replace is input pending entirely?
We've been asked that
Okay.
by some folks that would rather yield to more than just input. And I mean, you can look at them as bookends, and some people may decide, like, you still have to choose when to yield, right? Which isn't going to be all the time. As Andrew said, like there may be some problems with throughput where you don't want to do this that frequently, but for folks that just want to yield every 10, 15, whatever milliseconds, like then you may not need to use these is X pending APIs.
My guess is that we do not want to specify that the browser will handle all input before posting a new macro task. I think given the existing hooks in the specifications, that would be extremely difficult to describe. And it's not clear to me that it really adds much value. I think just saying we'll yield to the browser and the browser can do what it thinks is important is probably sufficient and an awful lot simpler. I can certainly imagine sort of pathological cases where a browser really would not want to handle input in this particular case. And so giving browsers the flexibility to schedule whatever they choose to do seems preferable to me.
Yeah, from the information we've gathered.
Go
ahead.
Sorry, I would add that the WebKit doesn't have any mechanism or plan to prioritize input, so that's just not a thing.
Is all input frame aligned in WebKit?
I'm sorry, what?
I'm guessing all input is still frame aligned.
What do you mean by that?
Or is it just continuous inputs that are aligned to vsync?
What do you mean by aligned?
So for example, in Chromium, we coalesce continuous events and dispatch them every frame instead of like in the middle. I'm mostly just asking because I'm curious if it's like truly FIFO in WebKit.
Yeah, that's just FIFO.
Got it. Okay, interesting. So in which case, that would be valuable to provide that guarantee. And it's important to say that the guarantee is not such that we only care to yield to input. None of the use cases that we've discussed with people, I've like expressed that desire. It's more so it's like, it's time for me to like give up the throne. Browser should do whatever work that it deems is a high priority. So we wouldn't need a like yield only to input function. That's not going to be great for UX. But yeah, if there's no real objections here, I think Tim's suggestion of expecting reasonable behavior, and if not, defaulting to maybe a timeout in the worst case, or potential throttling when input is detected, but it's not handled for the next macro task. That seems like fairly agreeable. Cool. So that's pretty much it for me. I guess I'll open up the last minute and 40 seconds, just like any overall questions.
A question just came to mind is presumably is input pending signal would give you the confidence to introduce a long task where previously you would not be confident and would have yield. And so one topic is yielding to input and to prioritize it, but another one is just yielding to other script. And so you can imagine misbehaving script, which would have previously yielded occasionally. So it goes round robin between contentious actors, whereas now someone could say like, there's no input, I'll just block it ad infinitum. So what about yielding to other script and making sure a bad actor doesn't sort of own the thread?
So I think the surface is probably explored more in detail by the sort of main thread scheduling stuff that was discussed yesterday. For ISMO pinning itself, it solves like the very specific case where the script already wants to do a long task and is incentivized to do so because it has like throughput wins that it's found. And in which case, like we retain that responsiveness and improve the user experience when like otherwise we wouldn't really be able to offer a compelling solution. I think that the problem of script prioritization and like improving that sort of cooperative multitasking that you mentioned is like really worthwhile. It just seems like very challenging and out of scope.
just wanted to add something to what you were saying, Michael. Our team's talked about this a little bit internally as a risk for this API, especially in context of, you know, and Andrew, I think we've discussed this as well, with if you have multiple pages sharing a process and you may not know about the input from another page if you're backgrounded, and we need to be really careful about messaging around this API to just not let folks think that they can just do long tasks forever. One mitigation we kind of thought of is like, we may, like, if it does become a problem, and it's not saying that it will, but like we could lie in his input pending. Like we can already return, like it's potential that we could lie and just say, yes, there's input pending if you were blocking, you know, the thread for too long and there's other things. I don't know if this would actually be something we would want to spec as a possibility or not, but that maybe there's a potential there.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's reasonable.
Is okay to block. I'm just thinking through, like, both some times where this might be false, even if there is no input pending, but also for future proofing, if there are other instances where it's not strictly related to input, but you want to, yeah, anyway. I mean, it's nice to scope it to specifically the problem that it's addressing, but also.
Yeah, we definitely want it to be like a composable building block, such that like we weren't going to over-engineer a solution to problems that weren't quite obvious yet, or as obvious as this problem space. Cool. Anything else, or do we get to see the thanks slide? Sorry, go ahead.
No, just regarding the incubation status question. So yeah, we discussed it, I believe, a couple of months back on the call. And so initially on one of the calls, yeah, we had the folks present on that call favorable of adoption, but on a later call, folks were less favorable of adoption. And yeah, I essentially didn't want to raise that question before rechartering because we don't necessarily have the time for that. And I think we can re-raise that question in like after rechartering in the future, if that makes sense.
Yep, sounds good to me.
Cool. So with that, we've gone through everything, and we're fashionably 2 minutes over. So thanks all, and we'll see you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Cheers.
everyone.